Taysom Hill reuniting with Denver Broncos head coach Sean Payton. We'll look at why this could happen and why it should not happen. All on today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.
You are Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Broncos Country? Welcome into another episode of Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, where you know it is your team every day for all your Broncos news, content, coverage, analysis, and more that you can't get anywhere else every single day, all year long. Locked on Broncos is the place to be. Thanks to all the everydayers out there in Broncos Country. Thanks for making us your first listen every single day. Make sure if you're not an everydayer already, you do just that so you never miss out on what's going on with your team without all of the fluff or the clickbait. This is the place to be. I'm Cody Roark, Broncos reporter for Mile High Sports, joined as always by Sayre Bedinger, site expert over there, predominantlyorange.com. And Broncos Country, we got a highly debated topic for you here on today's episode of the show. We'll wrap things up by taking really a look at the pros and cons for Taysom Hill coming to Denver, reasons for him not to come to Denver, but more importantly, we're going to kick things off by asking the question here: could Sean Payton and Taysom Hill reunite in Denver this season? Definitely something, Sayre, that is going on in terms of the social media discussions. I find it to be very interesting because this is one of those topics where it's like you look at Taysom Hill as a player. We all know how talented of a player he is, talented of an athlete. Obviously, Sean Payton has raved about Taysom Hill dating back to his time coaching him. But when we've talked about guys like Cooper Kupp, Deebo Samuel, the one thing that gets brought up, age, injuries. You look at Taysom Hill, age and injuries really are the biggest negative mark against him.
They are, Cody. I mean, shoot, Taysom and I are both, I guess he's going to be 35, so he's a little bit younger than I am, but I'm already 35. I can't imagine going out there and prepping to play an NFL season, but then again, I'm not Taysom Hill, but I can resonate with at least him being the old guy at this point. And I know I've been told, Cody, I've achieved UNC status, so I guess that means so has Taysom Hill at this point.
Yeah.
So we're talking about UNC Taysom Hill. And look, I think that it is interesting. There's double standards all over the place when you're having discussions. You know, you can't like this person, but I can like this person. You can't have, any good reasons to want this guy on the team, but I can have good reasons to want this guy. So I don't know. I personally love the open discussion, and I do believe that there's a good chance that Taysom Hill would come to Denver, regardless of whether or not anybody thinks it's a good idea. And we're going to talk about that on today's show, why it could be a good idea or a bad idea. But the NFL, we know this. It's so much about who you know. I mean, shoot, like you look at, Kubiak getting hired out in Seattle as the offensive coordinator. Who does he hire as a senior offensive advisor? Rick Dennison. It's like, oh my gosh, Kubiak and Dennison still together in the same NFL city. It's like a tale as old as time. It's all about who you know in today's NFL. Just look at the Denver offensive coaching staff with, Pete Carmichael there, Joe Lombardi. I don't want to say it's the good old boys club or anything like that, Cody, because that would be painting it in a negative light. There's definitely value to working together with people that you know and work well with, as you and I well know. It's like you and I do a good job with this podcast, at least I hope, and I think that we do. And I believe that we do. And there's a reason for that. And it's like, hey, if we would go do another project together, like, our streams on Wednesday nights, like we work together and we work well together. That's why we do those together. So same thing could be said of Taysom Hill going to Denver. It's like, hey, those guys, they just work well together. The Saints crew that has been together, they work well in tandem.
Well, and you look at all the ties too, like even Cody Roark in the front office, time in New Orleans, Darren Rizzi, now the special teams coordinator, who was the interim guy last year when he replaced Dennis Allen. Like Taysom Hill has been part of, a roster with those guys that have kind of either been behind the scenes or directly on the sideline there. And even obviously with Sean Payton. And Taysom Hill truly is, he's not just like this one position, right? He is what you would designate, in the college game today as athlete, ATH. That's just the type of player that he is. But for Taysom here, and this is why this is being brought up now as a potential discussion, the New Orleans Saints, as we all know, have Kellen Moore as their next head coach. They're undergoing what's expected to be a rebuild period here for them, especially with the cap situation that they also have there right now in New Orleans. And Taysom Hill is more than likely going to be a cap casualty. And obviously the Saints would incur quite a bit of dead cap by releasing him. But that's something that as you're going through a rebuild, teams typically take that on to be able to offset the cost and things like that, and maybe split it up there. And look, they could take a massive hit in year one like Denver did with Russell Wilson, or they can kind of split it in half and maybe try to get the higher one first and the lower hit the next year. But this opens up a cost-effective approach for Sean Payton and the Broncos to get Taysom Hill in the building, where if they do that, they get him in the building with Bo Lowry, who obviously has those ties there to the New Orleans Saints. And we've seen the Broncos' emphasis on getting guys back from major injuries, ACLs, Achilles injuries. Bo Lowry's done a tremendous job with that approach. But does it make sense here for Taysom and Sean Payton here as Bo Nix takes over as the team's quarterback? Because Taysom does play some of those special package type things where he comes in at QB. My only thing, Sayre, if Taysom Hill comes to Denver, I don't want it to interrupt any flow that you have here with Bo Nix. That to me is the biggest thing. Also age, he's going to be 35 this season, coming off of the ACL. We don't even know what his timeline specifically looks like. So right now I'm looking at it and I'm like, I could see Sean Payton and Taysom Hill reuniting, but is that going to be a move that, maybe happens later on down the road?
Yeah, that could very well be, especially because timing is everything with certain things like this. You never know when an injury would pop up, and then all of a sudden everybody in Broncos country is like, hey, Taysom Hill is healthy, let's bring him in. So that could be super helpful. I just think as far as you're building out a 90-man roster right now, right? And as you're building out a 90-man roster, I think it's helpful to have guys like this on your team, but like you said, it cannot be at the expense of somebody else. And I think that's what a lot of Broncos country is afraid of, is that Sean Payton will sign somebody like Taysom Hill after he's cut, and he'll be one of those guys that, hey, he's stealing snaps from somebody that we would otherwise rather see out there on the field. And I think that is a valid concern because of what we've seen the last couple of years with guys like Lil Jordan Humphrey and others within the offense that were kind of just like, I don't know, should that guy be playing over, for, in his case, Devon Vele or Troy Franklin, or, should Javonte Williams be playing over Audric Estime and things like this? I mean, these are questions that we've had with players who have been out there on the field who seem to have generated some favoritism with Sean Payton. So I think it's a valid concern in that regard. But when it comes to his injury history, his age, things like that, that doesn't worry me as much as, can he actually help the team? And would he be an asset to the team? And to me, Taysom Hill is kind of the ultimate team player in terms of like the dude. I don't even know if you give him a position. Like he's just football player, I guess, is what I would classify him as. And so I'm intrigued by the possibility, especially if the price is near the bottom of the barrel.
Well, and I think that's where, maybe things kind of play into the favor of Taysom coming to Denver here, because for Denver, it wouldn't cost them really much. To be honest with you, I could see it being a 2-year deal with really that second year being kind of optional here, like team option at that point. First year, maybe a 1 year, like 1 year. I mean, what would you pay Taysom? It's like Taysom's made quite a bit of money, obviously, off of his last extension here, but because of his age, because of injury, I don't see him getting a very strong market in terms of, hey, we're going to pay you a ton of money to come in and play this position. Whereas I think if Taysom comes to Denver, it really is like this 1 to 2 year window where that's it. Like that's going to probably be the final straw or final stop here for Taysom as he's entering this is going to be year number 9 in the NFL for him, which it's crazy to think about. It doesn't seem like that here, but I think you can look at these things, and for Sean Payton, it's okay. Does this make our offense better, right? And I think in some aspects, adding Taysom, if healthy, yes, it does, right? If he plays tight end, if he plays kind of this hybrid role. I mean, even the thing, and I know Broncos country's tired of hearing the term joker. That's been something that people are also debating on social media because, hey, like that has been the talking point of the offseason here. I do look at Taysom Hill and it's like, all right, this is a guy who does fit that joker type mold. But if the Broncos are going to bring in Taysom Hill, Sayre, they need to do it the right way, in a way that doesn't interrupt the flow and chemistry of the offense, the development of Bo Nix, and other things. And I think that's why it's important that you and I, and we're going to dive deep into it, Broncos country. Sayre and I are going to talk about reasons why the Broncos and Taysom Hill could work here in 2025. You'll get that and much more on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. Today's episode of the show is brought to you by our friends over there at Intuit TurboTax. And taxes was waiting and wondering and worrying if you were going to get any money back, and then waiting, wondering, and worrying some more. Now, Taxes is matching with a TurboTax expert who can do your taxes as soon as today. An expert who gives your taxes their undivided attention as they work on your return while you get real-time updates on their progress so you can focus on your day. An expert who will find you every deduction possible, file every form, every investment, everything with 100% accuracy. Also, you can get the most money back guaranteed. No waiting, no wondering, no worries. Now, this is Taxes. Get an expert now on TurboTax.com. Only available with TurboTax Live full service, real-time updates only in iOS mobile app. See guarantee details at TurboTax.com/guarantees.
When it comes to the NFL offseason, teams are always looking for the best bang for your buck. The Denver Broncos, they might be able to get a lot of bang out of the buck that is Taysom Hill if he does become available as expected. But Broncos Country doesn't want him to be the centerpiece of the offseason. So let's talk you into it a little bit. Let's tell you why Taysom Hill could be a really good addition to the Denver Broncos on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. And hey, before we get going on that, Broncos Country, appreciate you all so much for making us your first listen of the day every single day. You know, whether the Broncos sign Taysom Hill or do something crazy like trade 2 entire drafts basically for Russell Wilson, your boys Cody and Sayre, we got you covered no matter what happens with this organization. Big coaching moves, free agency, the combine coming up, mock drafts will start to fire up after free agency. So make sure you subscribe so you don't miss a single episode of the show. You're not going to want to miss out on anything. And Cody, let's sell this opportunity here. Let's be salesmen. We're going door to door right now. We're knocking on Broncos Country's doors and we're selling the idea of Taysom Hill. If anybody knocks on my door this summer, Cody, I've already asked my wife. I want a no solicitor sign on my house after getting absolutely royally just screwed last summer from a number of companies. But look, I think Taysom Hill offers you some really good upgrades in areas to the offense that the Broncos need. And I want to start the bidding right here. Okay. Versatility and experience in the offense. I think those are 2 primary reasons why Taysom would be a great addition in 2025 to the Denver Broncos.
Well, part of me is also wondering, too, because of his knowledge of Sean Payton's offense, how he likes things being ran. How does that fit with Adam Troutman, who's obviously on the roster, right? And look, I don't see Troutman being a player who's going to get cut or anything like that. I think Sean Payton values Troutman. Troutman does a lot of the dirty work. He's not going to be your best receiving tight end. I don't think that's the emphasis here. But it's like, if you do bring Taysom Hill to Denver, how does he work alongside Adam Troutman here? And I look at a lot of it, okay, are we going to see him listed up kind of what that Greg Dulcich role was early on in the season, where Greg was kind of like playing in the slot, but then he'd kind of be that motion offset wing guy where he'd kick out guys underneath. Part of me is wondering, what role would he exactly play? Would it be at the running back position at times where he is going to line up in the backfield? Is it going to be at tight end? I think if you come in right away, if Sean Payton says, hey, this is our vision for him, we're going to do this, but maybe it's not like a feature role. Maybe it's more of a package deal, right? Because even then, like, teams knew when Taysom Hill would take the field initially years back that, oh, hey, Taysom Hill, number 7 is in the game. This means that the play is going to him or it's going to be manufactured off of him. And I think that is where you have to create the diversification of your offense a little bit. And I think that's why how Denver approaches maybe wide receiver this season is going to be very big, maybe getting the running game going. But I am wondering here, is Sean Payton maybe banking on the run game as like, hey, we're going to focus on Jaleel McLaughlin, Audric Estime, Blake Watson, or Tyler Bidet, but we're also going to have Taysom Hill in there to be able to do it. I think that could be a reasonable thing that we see here in terms of the offseason vision. If we're looking at a planning board trying to get in the minds of Sean Payton or George Payton, certainly I can understand that. I'm also trying to figure out here, okay, what would the usage look like? Like, what are our realistic expectations for a guy like Hill as he's coming off of an ACL injury, especially at the age of 35? That to me is really the only obstacle. But let's bank on it. Like, let's talk hypotheticals here. Hypothetically, Sarah, Taysom Hill, fully healthy, no limitations coming off of the ACL because he's a freak athlete. What does his role actually look like that makes the most sense here for the Broncos offense?
I mean, I hate to say this term again, Cody, but I mean, the Joker is obviously in play here. And I know that a lot of Broncos country is getting frustrated by hearing that. But look, this is a guy who is a mismatch. And even in
Yeah.
the later years of his career here, he has been highly, highly effective. Like you look at the numbers over the last 3 seasons, listen to this stat. 94 touches over the last 3 years. Okay. Or excuse me, 281 total touches, 21 total touchdowns. So over a 17 game, average, that's 119 touches per 17 games and 9 touchdowns per 17 games. We're talking about roughly a 12 touches to 1 touchdown ratio. So when you talk about effectiveness per touch, wherever he's getting the ball, whether it's in the backfield, whether it's as a, the wildcat quarterback, that's another term. Maybe the Joker is trying to just do what the wildcat once did to people, Cody. Everybody was so sick of hearing the wildcat term out there. But I think he can do all those things. He can play tight end. He can win contested catch situations. He's good in the open field after the catch. I'm not trying to say that Taysom Hill is like this he's not going to win all pro honors probably this coming season. But when you're talking about a guy who on a 17 game average, 119 touches and 9 touchdowns in that time frame, I mean, when you're talking about a roughly 12-to-1 ratio there, that's pretty crazy for a guy who's in his mid-30s already. I don't know. I feel like that's a pretty huge notch on his belt if you're talking about, what role is he going to play? But I also think, look, if you don't want to roster 3 quarterbacks, you could have this guy playing a role for your offense, and he could still be an emergency third quarterback for you without taking up a third quarterback spot on the team.
That actually makes a lot of sense. I think when you look at it from that standpoint, certainly Denver, I felt like last year could have benefited from having an extra spot on the 53, right? Obviously, they had Jarrett Stidham, Zach Wilson together. We just did an episode on yesterday's show of Locked On Broncos where we talked about maybe why Zach Wilson should be the backup quarterback. But if you can have an extra roster spot where you can use that guy in some capacity on your offense, but also if something happens, you have an emergency designation quarterback, which look, the Broncos – what was it? The COVID year when they played the New Orleans Saints and Sean Payton that came to town? Yep. Was it Taysom Hill? That was the game plan, was stop Taysom Hill. And he and Latavius Murray went off against the Broncos. I think Isaac Yiadom had like a tip pass interception off of Taysom Hill. But aside from that, it was not successful for the Broncos against the Saints in that matchup, obviously at home in Denver there. So, I mean, I think that those are some reasons why Taysom would work here inside of this offense and this system too. And I also think it goes back to the familiarity concept that we talked about, right? What does Denver need? Like, they need guys that can play effective special teams play. And Taysom Hill is one of those guys. I mean, we saw fake punts last year by the Broncos. We saw fakes with Riley Dixon. Taysom Hill could be an up man that if you're in a short yardage situation, you can get like a direct snap to him and maybe get forward yards because he's going to push the pile a little bit. He is a core 4 special teams player that has offensive production capability, which I would argue he might offer more there than little Jordan Humphrey did this past season here for the Broncos if fully healthy. So I do think that these are some reasons why it would work here in Denver. And I also think maybe we have to shift our focus here as well as we look at this offense here. Can he still be productive, right? And this is where I think we all get caught up in thinking, right? When we look at skill players, we look at age. Can he be just as productive now as he was maybe 2 or 3 years ago? I think that's always a question, right? And every athlete runs into that. But there was a game specifically last year, Sarah. I think it was one game before he tore his ACL. They took on the Cleveland Browns, and Taysom Hill really was the offense here. Obviously, the Saints, they won this game 35-14, but Taysom Hill had 7 carries, Sarah, 138 yards, including 3 touchdowns on the ground. He had a 75-yard run. He was averaging 19.7 yards per attempt there. And in that game as well, he also had 8 catches on 10 targets for 50 yards. He really was the offense, right? And so I think even before the injury at this age, he was producing at a high level, especially in that game against the Cleveland Browns defense that obviously, Denver was able to put up over 40-plus points on them, but they still have really good players there. If he can come back from the injury, then I can see this working for Sean Payton and the Broncos. That, I think, is the gamble here.
Yeah, in 8 games last season total, he had 6 touchdowns, and the Broncos had 2 players on their entire team in 17 games last year, Marvin Mims and Cortland Sutton, that had 6 plus touchdowns. So Taysom Hill did that in 8 games. Like we mentioned, Cody, the efficiency per touch is still there. I mean, he's averaging 5.8 yards per carry over the last 3 seasons. He's averaging 77.4 catch percentage, 8.5 yards per reception. So to me, when you look at a guy like this, who, I mean, he can be a secondary return specialist with Marvin Mims out there instead of Tremont Smith. Like, he can do all of these different things and provide so much value. I just think at the price that it's going to cost, like, it's not going to cost much to get him. It's not going to cost much to sign Taysom Hill, especially because, I mean, he's drifting back towards his roots, right? He's a BYU guy. We know how much it meant to Zach Wilson to come back to Denver to play near Utah, where he's from, and Taysom Hill coming back to this Mountain West area. I just feel like it's all ideal for him. And I feel like it's setting up for him to be that kind of floor raiser for the offense. What we had contributions last year from guys like you mentioned, Lil Jordan Humphrey, Nate Adkins, Mike Burton, the things that those guys did to get involved in the offensive game plan. I feel like Taysom Hill could replace all of them in what they do, or maybe even throw Nate Adkins in Michael Burton's role and say, hey, what Nate did last year, Taysom's going to do this year, or, maybe some of it at least. So I don't know. I'm interested by this possibility. I think there's a lot of good. I think if he's healthy, Cody, the good vastly outweighs the bad.
And we know the Broncos do their extensive research on medicals for players who are coming off of injury. I mean, that's one thing that they really invest a lot in. So if they don't have any concerns, and this has become my motto when it comes to players who've been injured, Sayre, if Bo Lowry says, hey, we're good to go, I trust Bo Lowry. Bo knows everything at this point. And I think he's deserved that credence to say, hey, like, what we've done here from a medical standpoint, we know how to get guys where they need to be. So if that's the case, if the Broncos and Bo Lowry sign off on Taysom Hill, I'm on board with it, though. But, Broncos country, we looked at all the reasons why maybe Taysom can work here in Denver. Let's take a look at reasons why he may not work in the Mile High City. You'll get that and much more on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. Today's episode, Locked On Broncos, is brought to you by our friends over there at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. And when the game tips off, the NBA action, it's just getting started. And there's no better place to get in on it than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because with FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the entire game. So even if you miss the opening tip-off, or if you want to catch all the action on a fourth-quarter comeback, you can do so inside of the FanDuel app. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. And as the NBA push for the playoffs begins, end-of-the-year awards include the MVP race between SGA and Nikola Jokic. If you think Jokic is going to win it once again here, well, FanDuel allows you to place a bet on that to see if you're right at the end of the year. And right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. As we jump into the fourth quarter action on today's episode, Locked On Broncos, we'll dive deeper into why maybe Taysom Hill will not work out for the Broncos if they truly have interest in maybe signing him this offseason. But before we do that, I want to say thank you once again to all the everydayers out there in Broncos country, those of you who make us your first listen of the day for all your Broncos news, content, coverage, analysis, and more. This is the best place to be. We guarantee that every single day, all year long, because for the true fan, there is never an off season. All right, Sayre, playing devil's advocate, right? We're going door to door, knocking on Broncos country's doors and saying, hey, let's sell you on Taysom Hill. Well, let's maybe look at some reasons why Taysom might not work out in Denver with the direction that they're going. Sayre, I think the number one factor here is you look at the youth movement that Sean Payton has really embraced. And obviously last year they were really forced to do that because of Russell Wilson's dead cap. But that has paid off for them. The youth movement has actually been paying dividends for them on offense and on defense. And obviously, there's still a lot of room to improve. But does bringing in a player like Taysom Hill interrupt your youth movement approach? That's an interesting question I want to throw out to you.
Yeah, I think it is a valid question because, again, you do not want old guys that are not going to be on this team, maybe even beyond this year, right? Because let's be honest, like Taysom Hill, like you said, he's going to be 35 this season. Is he even realistically going to be a part of the team beyond this season? And with that in mind, if he's stealing snaps from somebody who definitely could be part of this team beyond this season, then that becomes a huge problem. And I know that that was a thing in New Orleans later in Drew Brees' career, Cody, where Taysom, everybody's kind of questioning Sean Payton. Like, what is Payton doing? I mean, you're pulling Drew Brees off the field. You're putting the ball in Taysom Hill's hands when you have one of the best quarterbacks in the league. And all of a sudden now you're overthinking things because of a guy that's on your roster who's talented for sure and who can be super effective in certain packages, but you're almost shoehorning those packages into the offense where, hey, it might just be better to let Drew Brees throw a slant to Michael Thomas, right? Or in the Broncos case, it might just be better try the deep dagger to Cortland Sutton with Bo Nix throwing the ball or a back shoulder fade. Like those things might be smarter to do in opportunities where you're giving Taysom Hill. So that's where I would have a problem with it, Cody, is where you start to overthink and get way too cute with it. There's benefits to having a versatile player like this, but it can also bring out the worst in terms of hubris in a head coach.
Yeah, and that honestly was one of my biggest concerns because even like several years ago when Drew Brees was still on the team before he retired, I was watching some Saints games and I was like, what is Sean doing? Like, why is Sean bringing Drew? Like, Drew Brees got them past midfield and all of a sudden now you're yanking him out. You're putting Taysom in. And I understand you want to be better in the red zone, but you have one of the most accurate passing quarterbacks in NFL history and you're getting fancy. You're getting cute. And I do feel like at times, and this has been a valid complaint about Sean Payton, but I just think this is who he is. There are times where he gets way too cute on his play design or on certain concepts, and it ends up biting the Broncos for a negative play. Like, for example, the end around to Marvin Mims. We know how great of an athlete Marvin is, but teams would almost know, like, hey, when Marvin's lined up a certain way, when he's closer to the offensive tackle or the tight end and he's off the line of scrimmage, I wonder what could be happening. Oh, backside motion, or at the snap, he might just take it in line and then get the handoff and then try to get outside. Like, teams knew that beforehand. So ideally, I don't want to see a situation, especially with Bo Nix here. What was one thing that the Broncos improved on this year that they didn't have with Russell Wilson, that they had with Bo Nix? They improved their red zone efficiency on the offensive side of the ball, and Bo Nix was a big proponent of that. Not only that, Bo, as we've seen, can use his legs in a way. It's like, all right, if you're trying to bring Taysom in for his legs in a situation and you're taking Bo out of the mix there, I don't know if I like that. You invested in this rookie quarterback to be your franchise guy. Don't interrupt that flow and that rhythm by getting too cute with gadget plays or with gadget players. I think you can find a way to use Taysom Hill without taking Bo Nix out of the equation here. That's one thing that I would say, like, it would not work if that was what Sean Payton's approach was going to be here with Hill this offseason if the Broncos signed him. And also, I think, another thing too, I think when you look at what we've talked about in the grand scheme of things, injuries, right? And obviously we highlighted the hypotheticals if his injury is fully healed and his medicals are all good. But anytime a player, like, you look at what's the website called where you can look at almost every player's injury that they've ever had?
The Draft
you look
Sharks.
At Draft Sharks. You look at Taysom Hill, this dude's got pages and pages and pages of injuries. So because of his high volume emphasis, he is going to absorb a little bit more contact. He's a little bit more prone for injury. So if you go out there and you sign him, and let's say you make him a big part of your offense and he gets injured, does that halt the progress that you've made with your offense? Or do you have something in mind where it's like, all right, hey, even if Taysom gets injured, we have a plan where even if he's out, it doesn't change our offense? That to me is where I don't want Sean to get into the deeper weeds of it.
Yeah, exactly. And to your point, Cody, about the Draft Sharks page, I mean, they also have like a projected chance of injury based on injury history. And last year they calculated an 81.2% chance of injury, which ended up unfortunately coming to fruition as Taysom only played in 8 games. So you obviously hope that a guy like this, if you're signing him to play any sort of role on your team and to be part of any packages, like, again, this is a difference of hey, we want this guy on our 90-man roster to see what he can do in the offseason versus this guy's guaranteed to make the 53 and he's going to be active on game days. So Taysom Hill, make no mistake, while you could pitch it as a, hey, this is a worthwhile 90-man roster flyer. I mean, if he's signed, he would undoubtedly be a 53-man roster guy, barring, some sort of injury before the season or just complete, ineptitude, which I wouldn't expect. But I mean, would you agree with me on that, Cody? I think that if the Broncos were to sign him, if he's cut by the Saints, he would be guaranteed a 53-man roster spot, which would guarantee a game day active role. And so that to me would be an indicator right there that, okay, you are going to be relying on this guy in some type of way, which is a risk in and of itself, at least in what we know about the injury history. But I know we're talking about the negative side in this segment. I couldn't help but daydream, Cody, as you were talking about it, the idea of read options with Bo Nix in the backfield with Taysom Hill, maybe Marvin Mims flanking him to his left. Like, can you imagine? That would throw off defenses quite a bit if you had Taysom Hill and Marvin Mims in the backfield of a running back that, hey, maybe the Broncos draft a Genty or a Travion Henderson or somebody like that that's split out wide. And all of a sudden, you've got a defense pretty well confused out there of what you're going to do. And then Bo Nix just takes off and runs because, well, he's the fastest player on the field at that point. But look, I love the idea of this. I don't love the downside of it because you would be banking on him playing a role. And I think there's risk attached to everybody. But this guy, he's a fascinating 1 to 2 year proposition to me.
Yeah, and I think the number one thing, as you mentioned, him being an automatic 53-man roster lock is who would he be pushing out? Essentially, like which player, that maybe could be on the cusp of making the roster would get pushed out in a sense in that regard. That's something I think you don't want to see happen here. But look, Broncos country, we've made the arguments for Taysom Hill. We've made the arguments against Taysom Hill. But ultimately, Sean Payton and the Broncos, they're going to do what they feel like is best. If this happens and he is released by the New Orleans Saints and the Broncos pick him up, we've looked at almost every side of the coin. But how would you feel about Taysom arriving in the Mile High City? With that said, Broncos country, that'll wrap up today's episode of the show. Make sure you share your thoughts with us on social media or wherever you get your podcasts on today's episode. And for all you everydayers out there, there's another hot topic right now in Broncos country related to a potential player who could get released by his current team. Could a reunion with Von Miller happen? And if so, what makes the most sense for the Broncos? We'll break that down and much more on tomorrow's episode of the show.